The following topics will be covered in this video film. Part 1, the basic adjustment of the aggregate from the turret, glue roller, and then the label magazine all the way to the pallet. Part 2, everything concerning the gripper cylinder, the exchange of worn parts and the resulting adjustment. Part 3, the operational check using glue where the individual components are finally adjusted. And Part 4, tips and tricks of troubleshooting when the label is not positioned as it should be. First, the basic adjustment of the aggregate. This covers the setting of the pallet turret, glue roller support, pallet motion, glue scraper, label magazine, and pallet height. First, the aggregate drive has to be disconnected from the machine for the basic adjustment. For this, the 0-point marking on the bottle table and the timing mark on the aggregate cover must line up. If this marking does not exist, it can be added. So the position of the aggregate with respect to the machine is firmly established. Now the upper 4 bolts of the universal joint shaft are loosened. The aggregate can then be easily turned by hand. The gluing precision is also strongly dependent on the even circular motion of the pallet turret. Therefore, it is important that the center shaft does not exceed a tolerance of more than 3/100ths of a millimeter. If it is greater than 3/100ths of a millimeter, the center shaft has to be aligned. For this, the polygon cup covers are removed. The cover and shaft are marked so that the original position is guaranteed when reassembled. Once the fixing screws are removed, the cover is easily levered using 2 screwdrivers. Take care that you don't damage the rubber seal. Now the cover can be lifted off without any effort. Beneath the gasket are the fixing screws for the center shaft. These are loosened. A shim is placed at the necessary points as required. Then the screws are tightened. If the aggregate has Allen screws, these are used for adjustment rather than the shim. A new measurement must be made after every adjustment. Repeat the process until the tolerance is less than 3/100ths of a millimeter. Insert the gasket before reassembly. When replacing the cover, be certain that the markings line up. Once all the screws are tightened, the pallets are inserted according to their numbers. When replacing the bearing plate, pallet number 1 is assigned to the marked bushing. Should the cover jam, the centering must be loosened, the cover repositioned, and the centering tightened again. Next, we test the pitch circle of each pallet using the dial gauge in order to guarantee an even pressure on the glue roller. The highest point of each pallet shaft must not deviate by more than 0.2 millimeters from one another. Should the measurements lie outside the tolerance, check the pallet shafts for damages or, as shown here, the cups for worn bushings. Defective parts must be replaced. If it was necessary to readjust the center shaft, the top bearing of the center shaft and the glue roller must be loosened. For this, the aggregate cover, held by 5 hexagonal screws, must be removed. Usually the bearings are held firmly by 2 pins, each which must be first removed. Then the fixing screws of the bearing are loosened. The bearings must be absolutely loose so that they can adapt when the cover is closed. The bearing of the center shaft is now tightened. The next adjustment is to control whether the pallets and glue roller are parallel and correctly spaced. The glue roller is lifted off. The drive bolt removed. And finally, the lower bearing loosened. Now the glue roller can be rotated independently of the aggregate. We center the pallet on the glue roller. In order to extend the contact, the pallets are separated as far as possible. Then the glue roller is brought close to the pallet so that there is no gap. The contact pressure can be felt using the pallets. It should compress the rubber by 1/10 of a millimeter. Now we can tighten the screws of the bearings. To see whether the glue roller and central shaft are parallel, check using a plain machined steel plate. By loosening these screws, we can readjust in the horizontal direction if necessary. Finally, the retaining ring is placed on top of the glue roller. Now the basic adjustment of the glue roller is completed. We now turn our attention to the motion of the pallets. The control cam for the motion path of the pallet is predetermined precisely by computer. An erroneous adjustment of the pallet with respect to the cam is indicated by one-sided faulty gluing. Therefore, the exact setting of the pallet is a prerequisite for correct gluing. The pallet set for the longest label is used for this. We test all pallets for their rolling off along the roller. The pallet is guided to the roller in the operating direction. Then the roller is manually turned in the direction opposite to its normal direction. This should require a little effort due to the friction of the rubber. This pressure must also exist at the center and at the end of the pallet. We can do a further adjustment using a pallet which is loose and therefore easy to move along the shaft. If the contact pressures are different, the Allen screws of the polygon cup must be loosened. The pallet shaft should now be easy to rotate. This pallet is guided to the glue roller, naturally in the operating direction, so that the leading edge contacts the roller under slight pressure. Now we have a coarse setting. We then hand tighten the 3 set screws and test the pressure at this location. The pallet is rotated further until the trailing edge contacts the roller. The contact pressure is compared with that of the leading edge and must be the same. If it is different, the position of the polygon cup is corrected by lightly tapping the pallet. This procedure is repeated until the contact pressure at both ends of the pallet is the same. If the pressure at both ends is too low, then the glue roller must be moved closer to the pallet turret, as already shown. Then the Allen screws are tightened firmly. Afterwards, we do the same adjustment with the rest of the pallets. Once all the screws are tightened, the cup covers with seals are replaced. The number on the metal cover must correspond to the number on the polygon cup and must be orientated to the fitting pin. The drive bolt for the glue roller is replaced and fixed with Loctite. Now that the turret adjustment is completed, we can move on to the basic adjustments of the glue scraper. We need the glue bowl, the pallets, the bearing plate, the glue roller and scraper. The cover must be remounted now. When lowering the cover, the pin must rest in the glue scraper. As a standard gauge for the glue scraper 0-point setting, the glue scraper should be positioned about 14 millimeters in front of the line between the glue roller and scraper support. Therefore, the X centers on the glue scraper must be set at center so that the subsequent adjustments can be done in both directions. The fixing bolts are loosened for the 0-point setting of the automatic gluing unit. Then the scraper blade is pushed to contact position. And the parallelism to the pressure plate, 28 millimeter spacing, is measured at top and bottom. This stopper screw has to be adjusted accordingly. Finally, the clamps are tightened again. The glue adjustment is activated in order to determine the 0 point of the glue adjustment knob. It is carefully turned until contact is made. The position of the knob is corrected to 0 by loosening the Allen screw. So that 0 and upwards means glue is added. The lever for the pre-gluing must be adjusted in such a manner that it falls back to its starting position when the glue thickness is set correctly and the automation is activated. If necessary, correct the position of the X-center. When the automatic is turned off, the scraper blade with the lower and upper skimmers is adjusted. For this, the glue scraper is loosened, lifted, pressed onto the roller and re-tightened. Then the upper skimmer can be positioned on top of the glue roller. Now that the basic adjustment of the turret and glue scraper is finished, we can turn to the adjustment of the label magazine. This adjustment is very important for a smooth operation and a neat removal of the label from the magazine. First, the label prongs are leveled. Once all the prongs are loosened, the flatness of the guide rails is checked and corrected if necessary. Using a plate, the foremost prong is determined and serves as a reference point. The second reference point for the vertical direction is determined with a front lay gauge. These two reference points serve as a basis in order to determine the opposing reference point for the horizontal direction. These three reference points now serve as the basis for placing the label magazine in the vertical position. All prongs not yet adjusted are now lowered to the plate and tightened. Now we tighten the screws of the label prongs really tightly. Finally, Finally, we check the ease of motion of the label follower and put a little oil on the guide rod. If a magazine is used repeatedly, the proper spaces for the gluing height of the label and magazine are placed on the machine. And tightened. For a rough check to see if the magazine height and thereby the gluing height of the labeled bottle on the bottle table are identical, the bottom edge of the label is marked on a metal ruler. This mark is then transferred to the lowest prong of the magazine. In case of large deviations, the spacers have to be corrected accordingly. Now we rotate the pallets away from the magazine and load it with labels. The label magazine carrier can be moved forward by manually operating the solenoid valve. The fingers are now adjusted so that the ends lie square with the labels. This adjustment should be monitored regularly later on during production, since there are deviations in the dimensions of the labels. And now to the setting of the pallet height. Since the label is larger than the pallet, it projects over the edge. This should be 1/3 at the top and 2/3 at the bottom. If this is not the case, the height must be corrected. So, as mentioned, 1/3 at the top and 2/3 at the bottom. The label prongs have to be centered exactly in the notches in order to prevent glue transfer. When set correctly, none of the prongs come into contact with the passing pallets. Now we mount the shoulder label magazine with the corresponding spacers. The gluing height of the shoulder label is determined by referring to the correct data sheet, or as shown here, by using a sample bottle. One measures from the bottom edge of both labels. The determined measurement is checked on the label magazine. In case of discrepancies, we correct the height of the spacers. The height of the shoulder pallet is now determined according to the same criteria as for the body pallet. 1/3 at the top and 2/3 at the bottom. Now, when the magazine is removed, the height of the rest of the pallets is aligned using this device. The part number is blended in at the bottom of the screen. The gripper finger notch is used as a reference point. A height gauge or a similar device can also be used for this alignment. At the end, all pallets are checked once again. The collars of the pallets are then placed on the bearing plate. The first part regarding the basic adjustment of the turret, glue roller, magazine and pallets is now over. In part 2 of this series, we will cover the maintenance and adjustment of the gripper cylinder. See you in part 2. In the first part of this series, we covered thoroughly the basic adjustment of the turret, glue roller, label magazine and pallets. We now turn to the overhaul, maintenance and adjustment of the gripper cylinder. The gripper's job is to remove the label from the pallets as gently as possible and transfer it just as gently to the bottle. A prerequisite for smooth operation is that the label must sit straight on the pallet and the bottle must be centered exactly. Gripper cylinder for every application. For example, for foiling with rotating transfer, when the label is to be placed on a flat shoulder area, or here for wine seals, where the anvil is pulled back before the label is transferred. The shifting gripper was designed for exceptionally large fluctuations of the bottle diameter. And if space is tight, an especially space-saving version. Fast machines need fast grippers, for example, our Top-Matic. However, here we limit ourselves to a normal 6-pitch gripper for body labeling. The shoulder gripper does not differ in principle from the body gripper, except that it usually has an additional sponge pusher. This has to compensate for differences in bottle diameter during label transfer. In order to guarantee optimal operation, the gripper must be maintained correctly and all worn parts must be replaced. For this, the sponges are removed. The roller levers are dismounted so that there is no pressure on the control cam. Now the play of the gripper hub can be tested, and the play between the stationary and rotating part. If there is too much play, as shown here, the inner brass hub must be exchanged. The outer friction ring is made of a wear-proof special steel and does not need to be replaced.